I went to visit my family home in the Appalachian Mountains. What I experienced will haunt me for the rest of my life. I had just turned 21 and was coming home for the summer after an exhausting semester of college. Some downtime with free meals included sounded like an excellent way to relax. I grew up in a small town in Watauga County, North Carolina. The Appalachian Mountains were practically in my backyard, while the house itself had always been very warm and inviting. I always felt there was something off with the forest behind it. It was just a feeling, though nothing substantial. In fact, my brother and I spent most of our time playing in those woods as kids. Besides the occasional eerie feeling and the obvious danger of wild animals, it was a safe place. Now, I hadn't stayed at the house for an extended period of time in almost 3 years, but I found myself settling back in quite nicely. With all the food I can eat and plenty of free time to binge my favorite shows and video games, I wondered why I went to college at all. It wasn't until around the 4th or 5th day of my visit that things started to change. I started to develop a seriously bad case of insomnia. I never had trouble sleeping. I was always the kind of person who could just put their head to a pillow and instantly fall asleep. So it was weird when all of a sudden I just couldn't, no matter how hard I tried. I felt like I was being watched or something, like there were a pair of eyes burning a hole through my skin every time the sun went down. It was the same every night. I would manage to drift off sometime around 3 to 5 a.m. but would be back up and awake by 8 at the latest. I just couldn't shake that feeling. After about a week of this, I noticed something strange. Every morning my door would be the tiniest bit ajar. Probably something you wouldn't notice unless you were running low on sleep and a bit paranoid. But I always showed it at night, always. I confronted my brother about it since he seemed like the prime suspect. I thought maybe this was some sort of welcome home prank, but he swore up and down that it wasn't him. Honestly, I believed him. He was 17 years old and over pranks, plus he would never have enough commitment to the bit to keep it up for a whole week. Since I wasn't sleeping anyways, I ripped the bell off an old Christmas ornament and hung it from the door. Now if that door opened, I was going to know about it. Fast forward to that night. It's 3:30 a.m. and I'm scrolling through YouTube looking for a comfort video to try and help me sleep when I hear it, the tiniest little chime of the bell. I looked over and saw that the door was almost halfway open. It had opened so silently that the bell hadn't even rung until now. The feeling was back, like a pair of eyes were boring into my soul. I peered into the darkness beyond the open door looking for any signs of life, but it was pitch black. Still, I kept staring into the space beyond the door looking for even the slightest movement. An hour went by and just when I started to think I was losing it, the blackness moved. A dark silhouette of a human slid across the doorway and down the hall. To my horror, I realized someone had been standing completely still in the doorway for over an hour, just staring at me. Since it hadn't moved, my eyes couldn't pick out its shape in the darkness. I was paralyzed with fear. 10 minutes went by before I gathered enough courage to get out of bed. My parents' room was on the other end of the house, so I thought if I crept out slowly and didn't make much noise, I would be just as hard to spot as the intruder. I held my breath and carefully crossed the house. I made it without being spotted and slipped into their room. I woke them up quietly and explained the situation. They called the police, and as my dad talked, we all heard something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, footsteps coming from somewhere on the other end of the house. Now, police response time can be quite slow in our area, and my dad decided there was no time to waste. He tells me to sneak out the back door since the intruder appears to be on the other end of the house into the woods, and wait for the police while my parents grab my brother from his room. We all plan to meet at the same spot about 100 yards into the forest. I make it to the back door to find it's already open. I figured that's how the intruder got in the first place and probably how he will try to get out, so I sprint as fast as I can into the woods. The forest is silent. I get to the designated spot and have to cover my mouth with my hand to muffle my scream. About 20 feet away is a body covered by a thin white sheet. Once again, I find myself completely immobilized by fear. A minute goes by, and the body hasn't moved. Suddenly I see the slightest twitch from beneath the sheet and realize it's still breathing. Every bone in my body was screaming to run the other direction, but I had nowhere to go, and this person didn't seem like a threat at the moment. So ever so slowly I crept up to it and removed the sheet. It was my brother, but his face had been painted red around his eyes and lips to look like some sort of demented clown. He was holding the red chapstick in his hand. I tried desperately to wake him up, but no matter how hard I shook him, he wouldn't. After my heart rate returned to a somewhat reasonable level and my head began to clear, I noticed a piece of paper he had balled up in his other hand. I grabbed it and started reading. One side of the page contained a single word, preordained. But it was spelled out letter by letter in random spots all over the page. The only reason I could tell that's what it spelled was because arrows were drawn in between each letter connecting them. It was truly bizarre. The other side was blank, except for a few small dots on each corner of the page. As I'm examining the note, my parents come running out of the house. They see my brother, and once they realize he's breathing, their demeanor changes entirely. It turns out there was no intruder, the person standing outside of my room. The person we heard down the hall and the person under the sheet were all the same. My brother had been sleepwalking, although it had been over 10 years since his last episode. He had sleepwalked before. Plus, on closer inspection, the sheet that was draped over him had come from his own bed. He likely just carried it with him while he walked around. I've heard of sleepwalkers doing some pretty strange things, but this takes the cake. Also, a lot of stuff still doesn't add up here. Why would he stand outside my room for hours on end watching me sleep? Why would he write preordained on a note in cryptic letters? The weirdest part of all I didn't realize until later. When I took a closer look at the note, I recognized the collection of dots on the other side of the page. It was Morse code. Each corner had Morse code corresponding to a different letter. When you put each letter together, it spelled help. My brother doesn't remember a thing, and I know for a fact he has no idea how to read or write Morse code. So how did he write the letter? Did he even write the letter at all? I just don't know. Sorry to leave you guys with a lot of unanswered questions, but I was not willing to stick around and look for answers. I ended my trip early and went back to my apartment. Now when I visit, I never stay long, and to this day I have trouble falling asleep. Follow for more horror stories.